Alhamdulillahi Rabbil Alameen wa salatu wa salamu ala ashrafil anbiya'i wal mursaleen wa ala alihi wa sahbihi ajma'in. Wa nashhadu an la ilaha illallah wahdahu la sharika la wa nashhadu anna Muhammadan abduhu wa rasuluhu. Rabbi shrah li sadri wa yassir li amri wahlul uqdatan min lisani yafqahu qawli. Subhanaka la ilma lana illa ma 'allamtana innaka antal alimul hakim. ونعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. In our Islamic tradition, everyone has heard the name Ibn Abbas. Ibn Abbas is the most recognized scholar of Islam, such that there is no scholar in the history of Islam who did not go through his studies and did not include Ibn Abbas in his dissertation, if you call it that. And Ibn Abbas, it's interesting that he began his scholarship at a very, very young age. He was just a young boy. In fact, when his peers would call him to come and play with him, he used to refuse and say, no, I want to sit with the Messenger of Allah and learn from him. And the other boys would tell him, there are other Sahabas doing that, other companions doing that, so you don't have to do that. And it's interesting in what he would say in response to them is that, but they will pass on, and then who will be there to carry this knowledge forward? And then much later in his years, in fact, when Ibn Abbas was now recognized as the scholar of Islam in his generation, and throughout 1400 years of Islamic scholarship, those boys ended up regretting much of what they said and did during that time, regretting that they wasted those efforts, and when they should have directed their efforts towards learning the knowledge of Islam, the deen of Islam. In fact, Abu Bakr as-Siddiq, Umar ibn Khattab said, تَفَقَّهُ قَبْلَ عَنْ تَسُودُ. Learn your fiqh, which will give you your way of life, before your way of life is hence dictated by external elements. And Ibn Abbas recollects a hadith from the Prophet that he heard from the Prophet ﷺ, in which Rasulullah gave a very interesting dynamic, that a sort of a philosophy that encompasses the entirety of human existence, social, cultural, civil existence. The Prophet ﷺ said, "Igtanim khamsan qabla khams." Take advantage of 5 before 5. Of 5 things before 5 things happen. Igtanim is to take advantage. Ghanima yaghnimu, to benefit from something through an effort. And he said, "Shababika qabla haramik." Take advantage of your youth before your old age. And youth, shabab, is defined in Islam as between the age of your childhood and the age of 40. And after 40 is basically your peak of your life. After that, it starts, taking a downward turn. This is called, in English, they call it a curvier linear life. Right? Maqawwas, which means arched. Your life is essentially like a curve. So hatta balagha arba'ina, your shabab reaches up until 40, and then begins kuhula, which is your elderly age now, what we call seniority. And then there is shaykhuka, which is old, and then that's the last phase in life. After that, it is ajuz, which is you're essentially completely helpless, right? And you're now right on the verge of death. And the youth is something that is that is not recognized by the youth itself. It's something that is often recognized psychologically once you've crossed over that age of youth. Looking at life in hindsight is when you realize that there are a lot of things that I could have done, I should have done, but I didn't, and that time is gone now. Because youth is when you've got nar, fire, that energy to accomplish things. And the Prophet is not referring to worldly things. He's referring to more spiritual things, because there are a lot of spiritual things, actions and deeds that you can only do in your youth, you cannot accomplish in your old age. Very few people can actually exert an effort to accomplish those elements, particularly when it comes to mental stability and emotional stability, the spiritual sense. For example, memorizing the Quran is something that the youth can really accomplish, but it's very difficult to do in the old age. And the same applies to the acquisition of knowledge, which is why we send our children to school and we don't send our elderly to school. It becomes an option for the elderly, but it becomes mandatory for children, because that's the age in which they can grasp. They have the opening, the fire, the energy to grasp. Now, one of the most interesting things that you see with our age as it's moving forward is that the capacity, the mental capacity of the youth is a deteriorating thing. It's something that's deteriorating generationally. The manner in which the older generations would learn and acquire is quite variant from the younger generation, our younger generation now. And because the older generation had to exert much more mental effort to acquire what they needed to acquire. A lot of it was reliant on memory. For example, when I was in school learning mathematics, the way I was supposed to learn it, the way I learned it was via the concentrated memorization of formulas, of tables, so that I could then do calculations mentally by just recalling how those calculations are done. Comparatively now to the younger generation of just something as simple as mathematics, it's more of they no longer have the effort to acquire knowledge, rather they have to be fed knowledge. It has to be forced down their throats, so to speak, right? And this is done via the simplification of language, which is the deliverance of knowledge. So mathematics is just one language as such, and it is a quantitative language. It's an analytic language, it's quantitative. So it's not that complex comparative to speech, where there are more complex languages involved. And in the early 50s, when television started coming out, they were doing studies to figure out why is it that older people were so able to grasp what was coming through the television, but then the younger generation were not hooked as much. And they found that the older people were watching television that was being delivered in what's called, in filmmaking, is called real time. So in real time, conversation is taking place in actual momentary gaps and pace, right? So some of the older films, when you look at some of the older films, they're very slow and they are, spaced out in such a way as you can relate with that as in real time. But the youth could not do it. They couldn't catch up to it. So they started making television in a way that would include a lot of these fast-moving elements, fast frames and car crashes and action and explosions and all that. And this has continued over up until now, the recent age, where television is delivered in such a way as it has about, on average, 20% of dialogue that has meaning or substance in real time, where an individual can watch and actually learn something or acquire something. And then 80% of which is essentially garbage. It is just words that have no meanings, phrases that have no relation, they have no depth. And then that 80% is essentially just fast-moving images. The resultant, essentially, generationally, is now number one. You've got a generation that is heavily inflicted with mental disorders such as ADHD, right? Attention deficit disorders, even autism to certain extents. You've also got a generation that essentially cannot slow down its thoughts. They cannot slow down their mental capacity in order to really grasp reality. It has to be fed into them at a high-paced, fast-paced, in a high-paced and fast-paced manner. And you find now a younger generation that's coming up now, children that are born now in the last 5 years or so. They cannot concentrate. They cannot eat unless they have a device in front of them. They can't sleep unless they have a device in front of them. They can't even speak or develop speech in a proper way. They might be able to issue some words here and there, but the speech is not structured. There's no proper pronunciation because they're not even making an effort to speak. All their communication is coming from a device, a lifeless device, and it's being spoon-fed or forced down their throats because they are not making an effort. And the fault primarily lies on us, the parents, because we take it for granted then that these are good things. They're acceptable and they should be acceptable. That there's no harm being done on the children because there's no physical harm that you can see happening. They're not actually losing a limb or losing their eyes or there is some physical damage, but it's not that plausible or that visual that you can actually document. The damage is mental and the damage is spiritual. And you find this generation and a past generation, what they call, generationally, they call it the post-millennial, the amillennial, and the pre-millennial, amillennial, and post-millennial. So pre-millennial are the generation born in the 80s, and then the amillennial are coming close to the 90s and the early 2000s. Now we have the post-millennial, who are essentially our children. They cannot even read books. They cannot read complex stories with complex characters who have depth and personality and interrelation. They cannot do what is known as abstraction of knowledge. They can't remove the concept and put it into their mind. It has to be shown to them. They cannot use their imaginative capacities to build the world inside their own thinking and figure things out for themselves. And now you find a generation that is highly reliant, completely dependent on tools, machineries, devices, and technology as a whole, which is why essentially the technology, the industry of technology does not call its customers as customers. It calls its customers users. And there's only one other industry that calls its customers users, and that's the drugs and pharmaceutical industry. And they call them users because these are individuals who are hooked on. They are addicted, they are dependent, they are reliant. They cannot function until they get their dosage. And the technological world also uses the same function. You cannot function, you cannot think, you cannot do anything unless you get that dose, unless you get that platform, something to help you move forward. So our oral tradition is steadily being lost. The generation that is growing up, their education is highly reliant on the dumbing down of language, the simplification of language, to use simple words, short words, and then to use those kind of words that are pleasing to the individual's self-consciousness, their self-esteem. In other words, to say words that are not offensive, or to use words that are politically correct, or to use words that are, it's all about the self and self-satisfaction. So how do you deliver knowledge to a generation that, number one, does not want to listen, does not want to hear because they might find it offensive that certain words, might hurt their feelings. Number two, how do you deliver knowledge to a generation that is unable to develop a sense of critical thinking. And number 3, how do you ensure that this generation does not essentially destroy itself? Because you can feed the generation as much technical information as you want to fit them into a certain cog in the machine of the great society, where they will function as a certain role, an accountant or a lawyer or a doctor or whatever, a policeman. These are functions. So you can feed them with all the procedures that they need to follow to fit in. But how do you build a generation that can also think critically in those situations, that can assess, that can evaluate, that can estimate, that can read a situation as opposed to just following procedure? Because now we are having a generation where doctors are not healers anymore, they are technicians, right? We are having a generation whereby everything is monetarily calculated. It is quantifiably calculated. How many hours you can bill, and what are the billing structures, and what's the value of each hour and the individual's life spent in that hour. There is no quality being delivered. So you got a generation that is completely disconnected from each other. There is essentially only one solution that can be applied, and it is the most difficult solution, because it is a solution that involves the breaking of a habit. It is a solution that requires to deal with a sense of addiction, and an addiction that is so strong that it is scientifically classified as to be in the same level of addiction as heroin and cocaine, psychologically. And that is to cut off from that technology. It is to limit the amount of technology that you would expose your child to, so that they can learn proper speech, they can learn proper communication, they can relate with people on a humane level, on an autonomous level. Because the resultant essentially is that they will become just another cog in the machine. The question you need to ask yourself, is that what you want for your children? The secular mentality, and this is all coming from the secular world. The secular mentality, and this is the definition of secular, is the removal of religion from state affair. And by the removal of religion, it is the removal of God. The moment you remove God, you remove all sense of spirituality. You no longer follow His guideline, His guides. When He said that He will send guidance to humanity, and whosoever follows that guidance will not be led astray. The moment you remove that, and you build your own moral code and your own ethical function as to what you think society should be, then clearly the resultant is evident. Whether it's capitalism, socialism, this ism, or whatever other ism it might be. If it is built by man, then the resultant is evident, because now we have a society that is known as a consumer society. And a lot of people do not know this. Why? Because they've lost the essence of language. That the term consumer, which is now today used in positive light, the term consumer was actually used in the older generations as one of the names of the devil. He was known as the devil, the despairer, and the consumer, because he was seen as he who consumed the soul of man, the essence of man, the true virtue of man. That was one of his names, the consumer. And the modern current generation does not recognize this. Why? Because they have lost the essence of language. They have lost and forgotten that words have meanings, and those meanings are essential, part and parcel of their existence. So the secular mentality does not see mankind and man's eternity as something that is a transcendence into the next world. It only sees man's eternity or as an immortality in this world, as a continuance of species and culture. Species being the human species, and then culture being the secular culture. These are the two elements that Iblis philosophized to Adam and Hawa, right? هل أدلك على شجرة الخلد? Should I show you the tree of immortality? وملك لا يبلى, and the kingdom that never decays. And so mankind as a species are essentially seen as some sort of a hive with different components that are meant to feed into a certain system that will ensure the continuance of the species and the continuance of that way of life. So the question comes about again, do you want to be a component in a system, in a machine, easily replaceable once you've worn out your usage? And do you want your children to be the same components who will just be replacing you generationally? Easily replaceable once their usage is no longer needed. وآخر الدعوانا أن الحمد لله رب العالمين ربنا تقبل منا إنك أنت السميع العليم وتب علينا يا مولانا إنك أنت التواب الرحيم برحمتك يا أرحم الراحمين بارك الله فيكم.